So today we're going to be hearing from Elliot Chapman-Jones, Head of Public Affairs at the Wildlife Trust, who will be speaking to us about the Nature Recovery Green Paper. This is an important document that lays out the UK government's proposals for restoring nature by 2030, including protection for different types of wildlife sites and species. The government wants to hear the views of people who aren't actually involved in developing environmental policy, and that includes young people. Our Bright Future works to help young people make our voices heard on the issues that matter to us. So the purpose of today's webinar is to improve our understanding of what can be a complicated subject so that we're all better equipped to have our say. Elliot will bring us up to speed and tell us how we can have a say on the Green Paper during a 15-minute presentation. He'll also be telling us a bit about the government's plans to introduce new environmental targets. Then we'll move on to have some time for any questions, and you can pop your questions in the chat or raise your hand and speak out loud, as it will be an interactive session. So without further ado, I will hand over to Elliot.
Thank you very much, Ashley, and I'll just share my screen if that's okay. Want to see that okay? Brilliant, thank you. So my name is Elliot Chapman-Jones. I'm Head of Public Affairs for the Wildlife Trust, and I'm going to be running through two really important documents that the government have recently published. The first is the Nature Recovery Green Paper, and the second is the Environment Target. So these are legally binding targets the government is going to set itself. The first one I'll touch on is the Green Paper, and with the obvious first question of what is a Green Paper? So a Green Paper is essentially a consultation document produced by the government. It allows people to have a say on different policy proposals or perhaps new laws that the government might look to be implementing. But largely, it's a set of proposals and questions that the government are going to put forward on a range of topics or issues relating to some of the government's policies. The Green Paper, it normally precludes a White Paper. The White Paper then has more specific proposals for new laws. At this moment, we've got the Green Paper, and it's all about nature's recovery. So it's all about how the government might change its protections for sites and species, as Ashley said, to make sure we get nature into recovery, halt its decline by 2030, and of course, meet the government's target to protect 30% of land and sea by 2030. To start off with our protected sites, what you've got in front of you is all our protected sites are different protections for areas of land in England. At the moment, our protected sites, as you can see, make up about 8% of land in England, and the protections come from many different areas and many different previous forms of legislation. Some of these from the European Union. So we had the habitats regulations, which created special areas of conservation or special protection areas, which give sites our highest level of protection in England. And we've also got our sites of special scientific interest. This is another protection afforded by the government, as well as things like national nature reserves. And what the government is trying to do with this Nature Recovery Green Paper is simplify this process and make sure that maybe all the protections come under one heading or one new name. But what do we want the Green Paper to do? What are the proposals that we think the Green Paper should bring forward to really make sure we've got nature's recovery and that we turn around the decline of nature? Well, number one is, strengthen the protections for our most valuable wildlife sites. As that little image showed, that was 8% of triple SIs that we have in the country, our sites of special scientific interest. But we need to make sure that these sites are more protected from things like inappropriate development or new road building, to make sure that when it comes to the planning process and development, these sites have much stronger protections than they do at the moment. Number two is all about improving the condition of those sites. Of our sites of special scientific interest, only about 38% of them are in favourable condition. So only about 38%, just over a third, currently in good condition for wildlife. We want to make sure the government gets much more of these sites into favourable condition so that they're really thriving homes for wildlife. And this is all about investing in the condition of these sites, making sure that they've got better management plans and making sure that we can get those sites into more favourable condition. And number 3 is all about making more space for nature. What the Wildlife Trusts have been calling for is a new wild belt designation. So although even if we strengthen the protections for all of these sites and improve the condition for those sites, we know it won't be enough to put nature on the path to recovery, because that will still only make up around 8 to 10% of land in England. So what we need to do to get us on that path to 30% of land protected by 2030 is make more space for nature. So areas that might be low biodiversity value, not so good for nature at the moment, invest in them to rewild them or create new spaces for nature and make sure that they have long-term protection. Wildlife Trusts are calling for this new wild belt designation. And to be fair, the government's Nature Recovery Green Paper did include a proposal for new nature recovery sites. We want to make sure that's as strong as possible to really kind of have strong protections for nature in these sites. And here is a quick video on everything we mean about wild belt.
Wild belt. Did you know that the UK is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world? We need to support nature's recovery and bring back our wild spaces, but currently there's no protection for recovering land. Because of this, animals are often left without viable habitats. This is why the Wildlife Trusts want to introduce the Wild Belt designation. With this new label, we can bring nature into these places and protect them for the future. By classifying these areas as Wild Belt, we could ensure they're protected from development and allowed to flourish. Communities would be at the heart of these spaces, breathing life back into the land. Wild Belt is a pivotal way to combat the climate and nature crisis our world faces. We need your help to connect and protect 30% of land and seas for nature by 2030. With Wild Belt, we can bring nature back.
So I'll just finally touch on what you can do in terms of the Green Paper, how you can have your say and where it's going next. The Green Paper is a consultation. It's open for 8 weeks until the 11th of May, I think it is. So you can submit a response to that consultation, particularly focusing on those 3 key messages of strengthening and protection for our wildlife sites, improving their condition and creating a new wildlife designation, which is all about nature's recovery. You can either do that through the formal consultation or send an email to the consultation email address, which we can provide. And DEFRA are also providing some roundtables for people to have their say on some of the stuff. The Green Paper proposals are, although they've only got the consultation for 8 weeks, after that, the government will be looking through all the detail and perhaps in the future, thinking about how they might legislate, how they might create new laws around these proposals. So there might be future opportunities as well to engage with MPs when those future laws come forward, because MPs will be voting. The next big thing that the government have published is their Environment Act targets consultation. Now you might remember last year, at the end of last year, the Environment Act was passed. It got the signature from the Queen and gained royal assent, thanks to lots of campaign, Our Bright Future, wildlife organisations, and of course the Wildlife Trusts. So the Environment Act is now law. And one of the key things in the Environment Act was that it required the government to set legally binding targets for nature, water, air quality and waste. So one of the most important things as part of this act was that the government now have to set these targets, these long-term targets, which go all the way up to 2042, and then make sure they've got the policies in place to meet them. So it's crucial that we make sure these targets are ambitious so that we get nature on the path to recovery. The consultation about the Environment Act targets is all about on the detail of these targets. So the Environment Act said, you've got to set a target. This consultation is looking at how ambitious these targets actually are. And it's really important because they're intended to be the kind of legal foundation for nature's recovery. It's the direction the government wants to head in for nature's recovery. So it's got to send a strong direction to make sure that the policy follows it. Of course, the government has set itself this target to halt nature's decline by 2030. That's an important one. The other areas it set itself was then to increase the amount of nature we have by 10% to 2042, to create 500,000 hectares of new wildlife habitat outside protected zones, as well as some targets around specific pollutants for water quality. But what do we want from the environmental targets? Where is the government going right, and where maybe does it need to do a bit more? The first one is what I mentioned about that long-term target for nature by 2042. And unfortunately, we think the government haven't really set themselves a particularly ambitious target. 10% more nature by 2042 compared to 2030 levels might mean at best we have about as much nature in 20 years' time as we do at the moment, maybe even a little bit less. That's not very ambitious. We want the government to say, actually, by 20 years' time, we're going to have restored nature. Nature will be in a better state for the next generation. And in 20 years' time, we'll be enjoying a country that has much more flourishing natural environment, not keeping as things are at the moment. The second big area is they haven't set themselves a target around the condition of our protected sites. So I talked about this earlier, that a lot of our protected sites are special areas for nature and not in a very good condition. Only about 38% of them are currently in favourable condition. The government had previously promised that they would improve that, they'd get at least 75% of these areas in good condition. But they've not made that a legally binding target which they've got to follow. So what we want the government to do is put that legally binding target under the Environment Act framework to make sure it meets it and make sure that it invests in these sites to get more of them in good condition. And the third big area that's really missing from the government's targets consultation is about water quality, the quality of our rivers and our streams. As I said, they set themselves some targets around specific pollutants, so some specific areas about why our water quality is not good. But what we need is an overall water quality condition target to make sure more of our waters are in good quality condition. At the moment, sadly, and almost unbelievably, 0% of our rivers and streams are in good overall status in terms of water quality. The government's really failing on its water quality targets at the moment. So we want to make sure it copies a legally binding target in this framework for overall water quality and gets more of our rivers and streams into good overall condition. So that environment targets consultation, that's going to last for 8 weeks as well. We're expecting that to finish in mid-May. And much like the Green Paper consultation, you can either respond online through the official consultation, or you can send emails through to the consultation email address. Once that consultation period is finished, the government is legally bound to set these targets by October. So by October, it's going to come up with the final set of targets that it's planning and set those in law. MPs, unfortunately, don't have much of a say in this process. So it's really important for this one that you make sure DEFRA really hears your voice and you get those emails through to the consultation team. Wildlife Trusts are also planning a campaign around some of the targets. So watch out for that in the first weeks of May and have your voice heard through the petitions that the Wildlife Trust will start. And I'll leave it there and take any questions.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Elliot. A really informative overview of two probably quite tricky subjects for most of us to get our heads around. So we'll take a few minutes now to do some questions. I'm going to kick off if that's all right. So you've spoken a bit about kind of what happens when these consultations ends and the involvement that MPs do or don't have in things going forward. And I want to ask a bit about us everyday people more generally, and specifically young people, lives and livelihoods going well beyond 2030 and 2042. Do you see a clear role for young people contributing to the ambitions for nature's recovery and new habitat creations, whether that's through, say, individual actions or things like more green jobs having a part to play?
Absolutely. I think there's 2 points here. One is that although in some of these areas MPs might not get a vote immediately on some of these issues, Secretary of State and ministers will listen to what MPs are saying. And MPs will definitely listen to what the young people in their constituencies are saying. So one way to really influence this is go and talk to your MP about some of this and tell them that the government should be doing more, it should be getting more ambitious on some of its nature targets, and ask them to write to the Secretary of State, because the Secretary of State will listen when MPs start knocking on his door and telling him to be more ambitious. The other point about green skills is really important, because for some of these targets, particularly the targets about more habitat restoration, we're going to need the skills and the young people and the future green jobs to be able to deliver some of them. So the more ambitious they are, the more green jobs will be required. Some of it, of course, will be delivered by public finance, by taxpayers. Some of it will be delivered by new habitat creation, by private finance. So there'll be more green jobs that people need to take up to ensure that these targets are delivered on.
More green jobs is certainly what we like to hear. By all means, if you've got questions, guys, do please either put in the chat or raise a hand, and we'll pick those up. But I'm going to carry on asking my questions if we've not got any others at the moment. So I'm going to raise the B word, Brexit. Are these targets and associated legislation, is that being brought forward as part of the Brexit process? Obviously, we know that nature doesn't just stop at national boundaries. So are these targets and these plans, are they compatible with what's happening in other European countries? And I'm thinking as well, at the start of your presentation, you mentioned how some protected sites were part of EU regulations. So can you speak a little bit about how that all fits together?
Yeah, the Nature Recovery Green Paper in particular has come about partially because of Brexit. So as you said, a lot of our protections for sites at the moment came from European legislation. That was, of course, copied over. It's things like the Habitats Directives. That was copied over into UK law after we left the European Union. So we still have that. But the Secretary of State is looking at how we might change those habitats regulations now that he has the power to do so. Our concern is, at the moment, the Nature Green Paper has the potential to weaken some of those protections around the habitats regulations assessments. These are kind of the rules that developers and anyone has to follow when it comes to things that might impact our protected sites. The Secretary of State is looking to change them. He says simplify. The big concern for the Wildlife Trust is that this might mean weaken and we might end up with less protections. That's why the big message I was trying to get across is that what we should be doing as part of the Nature Recovery Green Paper is what it says on the tin, all about recovery. And we should be better protecting those sites. All those sites that I showed on the map should have the highest level of protection. And in fact, we can improve some of our protections that we did have from Europe. So it should be all about how we better protect sites, not trying to simplify the process and make it easier for these sites to be damaged or destroyed.
Absolutely. Thanks, Elliot. I can see we've got a question in the chat now. So you're very welcome to read that out, but I'll read that out myself if you'd prefer. So Claire has asked, I'm curious to know a bit more about how we came to be so highly nature depleted. Of course, understanding the causes can help address ongoing issues and avoid repeating some of those mistakes.
It's a very good question, Claire. I'll give you a long answer or a short answer, but the really good report to kind of look at the big impacts and pressures facing wildlife is the State of Nature report. This was produced by about 50 wildlife organisations, and it brings together loads of data on the impacts that's currently happened on wildlife and shows us the declines that have happened largely over the last 50 years. The biggest impact, it says, is agricultural management. So agriculture and farming has had the biggest impact on wildlife, particularly the intensification of agriculture has had the biggest impact on wildlife loss over the last 50 years, particularly since the 1960s and 70s. And you can really see this through, for example, the farmland bird statistics. So the amount of farmland birds have decreased a lot quicker than birds outside farmland because of agricultural management. In fact, we've lost half our farmland birds in the last 50 years. The second big issue is about climate change. Climate change is, of course, having a big impact on how species can survive in the UK and globally, to be honest. And here, a lot of the evidence shows us that our protected site, that protected site network, is really important as a kind of buffer, a barrier to help species thrive and protect them against the effects that climate change is happening. The third big area is urbanisation. So development road development, housing, that has the biggest impact in species in terms of kind of direct habitat change. So it's lots of road development because largely it creates fragmentation. Wildlife isn't able to move about properly because it's being cut in half by inappropriate development. Lots of other issues. One is around hydrological effects. So water effects, largely water pollution is causing a big pressure. And it's one of the main reasons why lots of our protected wildlife sites aren't in good condition, because they're being polluted through things that might not be happening on site, but might be happening next to those sites. So pollution could be from agriculture, it could be from industry, all these sort of things. A few other bits, invasive non-native species. So these are kind of species that come aboard, have an impact. Woodland management, the destruction of woodland also has a big impact on our wildlife. But largely, if you're after one culprit over the last 60 years, it's been that kind of agricultural management that's had the massive effect on our wildlife. And a big change that the government is doing, it passed an Agriculture Act the year before last. And so now we're outside of the European Union looking at how it does agriculture policy and pays farmers subsidies. What we're hoping that the government will do is create a new system where it pays farmers subsidies based on the environmental benefits that they create. So a farmer will get a subsidy if he creates hedgerows or creates the huge amount of ponds that have gone missing across the farmed landscape. Improves soil quality, there's plants, trees and forests, there's loads of brilliant things they can do. But that just requires changing the subsidy system, the way we pay farmers, to make sure that farmers are increasing the amount of nature and the farm landscape. Which is, of course, as I'm sure you know, not only good for nature, but good for farming as well. It improves farm productivity, so it improves the amount of food that the farmer can make.
Thank you, Elliot. Lots of challenges there, but opportunities too. Claire, did you want to follow up on your question at all?
Yeah, it's really interesting. My dad was a farmer and his favourite bird was the lapwing, and he died a couple of years ago, but he would be devastated to know that fact about farmland. But at the same time, you know, I remember him sitting in his freezing cold little farm office doing soil tests and whatnot. But it was all about the yield, increasing the yield. That was the metric, was how much yield were you getting off the land. And you know, it just can't be single metrics. And on that point, I just wondered whether, now I haven't read the whole of it because it's 600 pages and it's written by an economist, but yeah, I know, which I'm not one of, the Dasgupta review, which says, you know, we need to put nature, we are part of nature, it's not a separate thing, it should be part of everything we do. And if we don't quickly get to that realization, you know, we're never really going to solve the kind of climate crisis or any other of the kind of crises that no one's really thinking about at the moment, but which are the next things to start hitting the headlines, in my view, in 5-6 years' time. Yeah, there's lots of different aspects of things to tackle, but also a really fundamental rethink probably of how we view our economy.
Absolutely right. I mean, Dasgupta gave quite a stark message, really, that if we don't take account for nature in the way we look at our economy, the prosperity of future generations will be severely at risk. You know, even the World Economic Forum is saying that the major risks facing our economy are either climate change or biodiversity loss. Over half of the GDP we create on the globe comes from nature. In fact, our whole economy is just a subsidiary of nature, really.
Yeah.
I don't think the Treasury or the government quite grasp the scale of the crisis. And I mean, one of the first steps that should really be taken is thinking about how much money it invests in practices that destroy nature and try and minimize those as much as possible, and minimize those incentives that destroy nature, and start investing in those ones that actually restore nature instead. And of course, Dasgupta did some really good messaging about education. and how young people should really, and how we should embed nature throughout the curriculum in terms of our education, because the more people are aware of it, the more they understand it, the more likely they are to protect.
Yeah, and in terms of education for young people, again, my view, it's a while since I've been involved in education, I think it's all, who's going to argue with a bit of English literature or a bit of numeracy or whatever? No one's going to argue with that. But it doesn't seem to me to be very well connected in with the world at the moment, right? So you go to school and you're fed whatever curriculum you're fed and you've got no real choice about that. But then you're bumped off out into the world with no preparation for that world, really, apart from, if you're lucky, what your parents or friends might have told you, which probably isn't actually all that much. How do you digest that when you're 16? So I think there is a huge education piece around all of this, around teaching us a different way of thinking, new language. And I would consider myself reasonably well educated on some of this stuff, but I'm 52, right? And I've had time recently to kind of get myself a little bit educated, but I don't feel like I've got the language to articulate the scale of the problem. So I don't know whether you've got any thoughts or tips on how we might do that. But not only for young people, right, but for, for everybody. Everyone's got to start making changes, right?
That's a very good question. I don't know if Roberta, you want to come in here? You've been doing lots of thinking around education.
And I think that it's important to not only to communicate, but to give the experience to young people. So I think that as important as language is other medium. And I think it's important to learn but also about nature. So it's like about nature in schools, but also outside of schools, like bringing the classroom outside in green spaces, because it's from that experience that it's like more, that you connect with nature more, like not only with words. I think it's, it's not only finding the words, but also finding the space for nature and like for the young people to spend time in nature. That's important.
Get hands on. Bit of pondering.
Yes, exactly. I used to run like a project with children in a playground, and you could see them like starting with completely kind of disgusted about the worms, having on their hands worms and touching the soil, and then days after really enjoying it. You could see the change, like the perception, and that's something that will stay with children becoming young people, young adults, and in their own life. So I think that it's important to give the knowledge to the children and young people, but also that experience to get back to nature when they need it, because it's so good for also for your mental health, for your physical health, for your well-being. Yeah. And I've got a question for you, Elliot, if you mind. And thank you for a brilliant speech presentation. So I was thinking about monitoring. You said lots of targets, quite complex targets. And I know that usually the important things are not measured well enough. Talk about nature, talk about like how DEFRA currently hasn't got a deeply understanding of like the gaps and the capacity gaps in terms of delivering the 25 years environment plan. So how will these targets will be measured, monitored? Will we know if things are achieved in terms of moving in the right direction in terms of wildlife abundance? How do we make sure that we are going towards the right direction?
Good question. For the species abundance one, they'll take kind of about 1,000 species and then look at the trends over years. So they do it very similar to how they do the state of nature reports, where they just gather lots of data and look at the trends over years. I can't give you a full answer because DEFRA are meant to publish a evidence pack which tells us exactly how they're going to monitor all these things. haven't yet published that. So we're waiting to see, we've waited apparently 1,000 pages long, this document, on all the detail about how they're going to do some of the measurements behind these kind of top level statistics. But you make a very important point around monitoring, which is really important to the Green Paper and some of our protected sites. In 2021, 78% of our protected sites hadn't been monitored in over 6 years. So all these protected sites, we know many of them aren't in good condition. The government is just not investing in the monitoring that's needed to make sure that these sites are in good condition, or whether they might need some kind of work or some better management plans. A lot of this is because largely of a lack of funding for biodiversity over the last 5 to 10 years, which has slowly declined, and particularly cuts to our arm's length bodies like Natural England, whose job it is to make sure that these sites are properly monitored and protected. And essentially the government needs to make sure that there's better investment in that area to make sure these sites are better monitored and we can get more of them in condition.
And I've got another one. Which part worries you more? Makes you worried more, and which part excites you more? Like of these, of the Green Paper and environmental targets.
I'll do 2 exciting things and 1 worrying thing. I'll do it in a bit of a sandwich. So let's start with the first exciting thing. Is this new nature recovery designation. So the government didn't put a huge amount of detail in the Green Paper, but it said it was exploring a new nature recovery designation. The Wildlife Trust for the last couple of years have been calling for this new wild belt designation because there's a big gap in our current landscape of how we protect sites. We can protect those really good sites, the kind of jewels in the crown, the best bits. What we can't do is protect those sites that might not be very good for nature at the moment. But organisations like the Wildlife Trust, or perhaps farmers, are investing in them and putting resources in them to make them better for nature. We think those sites we should have the ability to protect them, because only if we protect those sites can we connect all the sites up and allow wildlife to move around the place. But the government's got to get this new wildlife recovery designation right. It's got to make sure there's strong protections in there. It can't just be some lines on a map. The most worrying thing, I think, is the changes to site protections. So it's changing the way that we might be able to protect our sites from what we have at the moment, which is things like sites of special scientific interest and the laws that come over from Europe. The big worry is that this could lower the protections for wildlife. What we want is to strengthen them all. When the government uses words like simplification, sometimes we worry that means we're taking away some of the protections that it previously had. So the big worry is that we end up with weaker protections than we had before. And we'll end on a good note. The government has, of course, putting in law a target to halt the decline in the abundance of species by 2030. Within 7.5 years, wildlife decline should stop. What this target should be, it should be a kind of net zero for nature, like our climate target, where all government policies should now be focused on making sure we halt that decline in nature. For too long, a lot of thinking around nature has been just siloed in the Department for the Environment. So things like the 25-year Environment Plan, other government departments like transport or business haven't been paying enough attention to it. Hopefully, with the government now legally bound to meet this target within the next 7 years, all government departments, and particularly, as you mentioned, Claire, the Treasury, when you're thinking about the economics of biodiversity, all government departments should be thinking, how can I do my bit to make sure that we halt nature's decline?
Thank you.
I have a question. So I think it might have been covered slightly already, but I was just going to ask, why do you think it's so important that young people have a really good understanding of the paper? And why do you think it's important that they should be able to put their views forward?
I think largely because they're going to be most impacted by this, actually. In 2042, of course, when the government's saying when most of these targets will end, young people will be in their 30s probably by then, in their 30s or 40s. So it's them who's going to be kind of owning this future. And what we want to see from them is a restored natural environment in a better state. We could be one of the first generations in a long, long time before the Second World War, which actually hands over our natural environment in a better state than we found it. I mean, what a brilliant gift for young people. But so that's why it's important we hold these politicians to account and make sure that they actually do this, because we know politicians do care about the voices of young people when they speak up. That's why Depleted are trying to invite young people into some of these conversations about the Green Paper, because ultimately it's their future.
Thank you. Yeah, very true.
Thanks, Elliot. I think we've got time still for one or two more questions. So again, feel free to raise a hand or pop in the chat. I would like to pick up on climate change has, of course, been mentioned a couple of times. I'm just wondering, will both the Green Paper and the target proposals have an impact on our ambitions and our ability to tackle climate change?
Yes, I think they will, ultimately because the climate and nature crises are inextricably linked with each other. You can't solve one without the other one. So when it comes to protecting more of our land for nature, that will help us lock up carbon, help us tackle climate change. So the more land that we can protect, the more trees that we can plant, more peatlands that we can restore, the easier it will be for us not only to reach our climate goals and cut down our emissions in terms of carbon, but adapt to the climate change that might already be happening. So we know that we're already at over 1 degree of warming, and that's going to have an impact on nature. So we need to be able to adapt to some of those changes that we know is already coming. So yes, the more ambitious they are in terms of the Green Paper and the targets for nature, the easier job we'll have in tackling climate.
Absolutely. And one last question from me then. These proposals, what would they actually look like on the ground if they go ahead?
A very good question. Ultimately, more nature. There was a review done about 10 years ago by a chap called Professor John Lawton. And what that looked at was our wildlife science. Are they doing the job we set them out for? Are they helping nature to recover? And the conclusion he came up with is that we need more wildlife sites. We need those wildlife sites to be bigger, better condition, and more joined up so nature can move around the place. And ultimately, that's what these proposals should try and do, is follow what he set out 10 years ago and make sure we have more wildlife sites, they're in better condition, and they're properly connected so wildlife can move around the place. So in 2042, or when these targets come to an end, or when the government's got these proposals in place, that's essentially where we should end up. Much more space for nature, it's better connected, and those trends for wildlife that we've seen over the last 50 years, slowly declining, are going in the other direction. And we can have more things like lapwings, Claire, in the farmed landscape, and all those other beautiful birds and hedgehogs and mammals and the species that we love.
Yeah, they are fantastic, actually, lapwings, beautiful. Or peewits, that's what I used to call them, because that's the noise they make, right? My only bird knowledge.
Yeah, I think that's a future we definitely all like to see for sure. Okay, we've only got a couple minutes left now, so Ashley, I'm going to hand back over to you to bring us to a close.
Perfect. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and a special thank you to Elliot for genuinely sharing his time and expertise. Our Bright Future often run online webinars to inform and upskill young people on issues related to the environment, including an upcoming webinar on green jobs at the end of this month, which is on the 28th of April. The best way to keep up to date with our latest events and opportunities is to follow us on social media at Bright Future and subscribe to our monthly newsletter. Isla is going to put the sign up link into the chat now, as well as Roberta's going to put in a link to our toolkits. So if you've got any questions, you can also reach out to us via email, which is also being shared through the chat. Yeah, so thank you everyone, and that brings the webinar to a close.
Thanks, Ashley.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you very much.
Brilliant, thank you.